Court records from Wilkinson County, Georgia, mention it in the driest possible language. 5 plantation overseers entered the Ojai River bottomlands on October 14, 1839. Only one came back. The paper calls it lost to swamp conditions, as if the forest were just bad weather. It doesn't mention the scratches that covered the survivor's hands in deliberate patterns, or how he spent 3 weeks drawing the same creek symbol in the dirt, a sign the elders said meant one thing: the hunted becoming the hunter. By the time those records were written, the truth was already being buried. Pages went missing from county files in 1847, and the descendants of those overseers learned early never to answer questions about what happened in the bottomlands. But the evidence that survives, scattered through forgotten testimonies and half-ruined depositions, tells a story that should terrify anyone who thinks numbers and guns guarantee victory. It begins on a fog-heavy morning, on a struggling plantation pressed against a stretch of swamp. The Creek people had always treated with caution. Wilkinson County, Georgia, sat in an uneasy strip of land in 1839. Too far from the polished world of Savannah's coastal elite, too close to the Creek territories that had only recently been emptied by force. This was not the land of graceful mansions and old family names. It was a place for men who had failed somewhere else and come here hoping the soil would forgive them. The Gresham plantation was one of those desperate enterprises. 400 acres of stubborn earth, 37 enslaved people, and a White House that looked more confident from a distance than the books inside it really were. Thomas Gresham had arrived from South Carolina in 1834 with nothing but debt and determination. Bad seasons had ruined him once already. Georgia was his second attempt at fortune. 5 years later, he was still perched on the edge of ruin. His cotton yields lagged far behind his neighbors. Fields exhausted themselves faster than he could clear new ones. His property, as he wrote in his ledgers, was, in his own words, unmanageable. To fix that, he hired more overseers than any plantation of his size needed. 5 in total. The neighbors' wives whispered the real reason. These were men other plantations had fired for being too cruel, even by the brutal standards of Alabama and Mississippi. Men no one else would touch. Gresham hired them because they were cheap and didn't ask questions. Jacob Yarrow was their leader, a 42-year-old overseer who had spent his life turning suffering into numbers on a page. He kept meticulous punishment logs, recording lashes and labor lost, calculating exactly how much pain a body could withstand without dropping productivity. His younger brother, Samuel, shadowed him, imitating Jacob's methods but lacking his control, the way a dog learns cruelty faster than discipline. The other 3, Nathaniel Cruz, William Tyson, and Henry Burke, were younger and meaner, drawn to Gresham's place because it offered something they wanted more than steady pay: license. Here, brutality wasn't a problem. It was a job requirement. Among the 37 enslaved people forced to work this failing estate was a girl named Celia. She was 15 years old in October of 1839. Her mother had been Creek, taken during the violent years before removal, sold into bondage despite the law's uneasy edges around enslaving native women. Her father had been African, brought illegally into Georgia despite federal prohibitions that existed only on paper. Celia's very existence was a collision of 2 worlds that white planters wanted to control but never fully understood. From her mother, Celia inherited the bottomlands, not in property, but in knowledge. Before fever took her in 1838, Celia's mother had taught her daughter to read the swamp the way white men read ledger books. She taught her which plants fed you and which killed you, how to find clean water in a world that seemed made of rot, how moss grew on certain sides of trees, how animal tracks changed before storms, how the Ojai's channels shifted with the seasons. From her father, Celia inherited hands that could fix and build, able to turn scraps and cast-offs into tools. She learned to sharpen broken metal into blades, to twist fibers into cord, to see possibility in what others considered useless. On the plantation, Celia's assigned role sounded safer than most. She worked the vegetable gardens near the main house, carrying water, tending kitchen plots, bringing in greens and roots that softened the monotony of cornmeal and salt pork. In theory, this kept her away from the worst of the field overseer's attention. In reality, the death of Mrs. Gresham 2 years earlier had left no white woman to shield young girls from male interest. As Celia grew into her teens, the eyes on her changed. Glances lingered longer. Voices shifted tone. She became an object of conversation, then an unspoken promise. She learned to measure danger in the way Samuel's hand rested a little too comfortably on his rifle, in the way jokes stopped when she walked past. She adapted to survive. She moved quietly, but never like prey, always where others could see her, always in the presence of multiple witnesses when she could manage it. She kept her head down, her answers short, her expression neutral. She made herself seem obedient but forgettable, a girl who knew her place, a girl not worth the trouble it would take to break her will. Privately, she worked on something else, a quiet, methodical preparation for a day she knew was coming. The Creek removal of 1836 had severed the last visible link between Gresham's enslaved workers and the indigenous communities nearby, but it hadn't severed knowledge. Celia's mother had poured everything she knew into her daughter in those final months, not as stories, but as instructions. Remember this channel when the river floods. Remember this island of slightly higher ground. Remember this tree with the split trunk. It points toward dry land. Remember where we could live if we had to disappear. Celia listened, the way someone listens to a map of the future, repeating details to herself at night, tracing routes with her finger in the dust of the cabin floor. By the morning of October 14th, that map was complete. The day started wrapped in fog so thick the big house, overseer cabins, and fields hovered as vague shapes in a world washed to gray. Work didn't stop for weather. At dawn, the enslaved were driven into the cotton rows, moving like ghosts through white bowls and white mist. Celia walked between them with her water buckets, stopping often, keeping herself visible, placing her body where as many eyes as possible could see her. Safety, she knew, lived in numbers and witnesses, at least for a while. Around mid-morning, Samuel Yarrow appeared through the fog, his silhouette resolving into a man whose presence made conversation around him die. He called Celia by name, his voice too casual, too calm. He told her the head overseer wanted her at the cabin. No explanation, no other workers summoned. Just her. She understood exactly what that meant. There was no open refusal that wouldn't end in immediate violence, so Celia did what enslaved people had been forced to do for generations. She obeyed, or seemed to. She picked up her buckets, walked toward the overseer's cabin as instructed, eyes down, shoulders small. Workers watched her go with tight jaws and lowered gazes, knowing there was nothing they could do without drawing the whip onto themselves. But when Celia reached the cabin, she didn't turn toward the door. She kept walking. She passed the rough-hewn steps, past the chopped wood stacked against the wall, and continued straight toward the eastern property line. The fog began to thin as she approached the tree line where cultivated land ended and wilderness began. Her pace was steady, not quite fast enough to signal open flight, but faster than an errand should require. Behind her, there was a beat of stunned silence, then Samuel's shout, sharp with surprise, then anger. Celia didn't run. Not yet. Running would declare her guilty in their eyes, turn suspicion into justification. She walked with the posture of someone following orders, as if Jacob had told her to check a fence or fetch a tool. But she listened to the sounds behind her. Samuel's boots beating the dirt, his voice rising as he yelled for others. Within moments, more footsteps joined his. Jacob's deeper command cut through the noise, and the younger overseer's eager responses followed like dogs catching a scent. Only when their voices carried that particular edge, the excited pitchmen developed when they thought they'd been given permission, did Celia finally break into a run. The edge of the bottomlands came sudden as a step off a cliff. One moment, the ground was firm under her bare feet, dust and weeds and the occasional root. The next, the earth turned soft and uncertain, giving way to damp soil and slick moss. The air changed with it, thickening, filling with the smell of water and rot and something older than either. The cypress trees rose ahead, crowded together so densely that the sunlight beyond the fog barely reached the ground. Celia hit the tree line at full speed, feet finding purchase where a man in boots would slide. Behind her, the voices grew louder, then fragmented as the fog scattered echoes into the trees. Samuel shouted orders he had no right to give. Jacob's commands tried to reassert control. The younger overseers whooped and laughed, already imagining how this hunt would end. At the edge of the field, Thomas Gresham himself appeared, watching as his 5 overseers grabbed rifles and rope, confident this would be just another example to remind his property that escape was impossible. A field hand, later called to testify, would remember Gresham's words clearly. He told the men to bring her back unspoiled, because damaged property couldn't be sold and he needed every asset he could liquidate. Jacob's answer was quieter, meant only for the men around him. The witness wouldn't repeat those words, only say they had nothing to do with property value and everything to do with cruelty. 15 minutes after Celia disappeared into the trees, 5 armed men followed. They entered the bottomlands with rifles, knives, rope, and absolute certainty that the world still worked the way it did in the fields behind them, that numbers and weapons would always turn a girl into prey. They believed they were stepping into hostile terrain to drag their quarry back to her rightful place. None of them understood that the moment they crossed beneath those cypress branches, the roles had already begun to shift. The forest had chosen its lesson. The overseers entered the bottomlands with the swagger of men who had never truly feared anything. At first, everything seemed to confirm their expectations. Celia's trail was easy to follow. Broken twigs, damp footprints, and disturbed moss led deeper into the wilderness like a map drawn for beginners. Jacob Yarrow pointed out each sign with smug precision, lecturing the younger men as if this pursuit were a casual exercise rather than a chase born of violence. But as the sun climbed and the fog burned away, the trail began to twist in ways that unsettled even him. Sometimes her tracks doubled back on themselves. Other times they vanished entirely, only to reappear yards away. Samuel insisted she was panicking, running in circles, too young and frightened to think clearly. But the inconsistencies weren't the chaos of fear. They were patterns, deliberate misdirections designed to waste their time and tire them out. By late afternoon, the bottomlands had begun to reveal their true nature. Ground that appeared solid suddenly trembled underfoot. Water seeped through cracks that hadn't existed moments earlier. Curtains of Spanish moss blocked the light, turning the world into a maze of shadows. The men pressed forward anyway, still confident that the forest would bend to their will. When darkness fell, they made camp on a rare mound of dry ground, lighting a fire they hoped would keep danger at bay. Yet when dawn came, their packs had been opened, not torn or rummaged through but carefully sorted. Food was missing, water was missing. One knife had been taken without waking the man who slept with it at his side. Henry Burke swore he'd stayed awake the entire night, but the precision of the theft proved otherwise. The realization settled over them like a suffocating fog. Celia had been inside their camp, close enough to touch them, while they sat armed and alert. They had not been hunting her. They had been followed, studied, measured, and now the forest had closed behind them like a mouth dot. By mid-morning of the second day, the men began to understand, not consciously, not in words, but in the tightening of their throats and the quickening of their breaths, that something was profoundly wrong. The forest no longer felt like a place they were moving through. It felt like a place moving around them. Fresh markings began appearing on the trees. Long, deliberate scratches arranged in creek patterns none of them could read. The sap still glistened. Henry Burke swore the symbols hadn't been there the day before. Jacob knew they hadn't. Each carved mark stood at the exact height of a human hand, her hand. She wasn't lost. She wasn't fleeing. She was charting their path, recording them, studying them. By afternoon, they discovered the first cache, a hollow cypress containing pieces of their own belongings. Rope cut into measured lengths, a scrap of Henry's shirt, empty rifle casings none remembered dropping. These items weren't scattered. They were arranged, almost ritualistically. Above them, carved into the trunk, was another symbol. William Tyson blanched at the sight of it, muttering they should turn back. But Jacob refused. Pride demanded they continue. 5 armed white men could not return to a plantation claiming defeat at the hands of a 15-year-old girl. Still, the forest pressed closer. Paths twisted unexpectedly. Ground that looked dry collapsed into mud deep enough to swallow a boot. The curtain-like moss shifted with no wind. Even the air felt wrong, thick, listening. By evening they camped again, this time refusing sleep, sitting shoulder to shoulder with rifles across their knees. They were certain nothing could approach unnoticed. Yet, sometime before dawn, Celia returned. Their packs were opened once more with surgical care. More food gone, a canteen missing, and as Henry frantically counted their supplies, he realized something worse, something impossible. She had taken items from within the circle they had formed while all 5 men were awake. No footprints marked the mud. No bent grass betrayed her steps, but she had been there, moving like smoke, taking what she needed while they clutched rifles and stared into the dark. The men looked at each other with wild, hollow eyes as the truth settled in. The hunt was no longer about catching a runaway. The hunt had inverted. They were the ones being driven, guided, and catalogued. One small, calculated step at a time. The third morning brought a new terror, the kind that doesn't roar or strike, but settles quietly into a man's bones. Henry Burke's rifle was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. He insisted he'd been holding it at dawn. One blink later, it had vanished. No tracks, no sounds, no sign of intrusion, just absence. The forest seemed to swallow the object whole, as though helping Celia dismantle the men piece by piece. Their confidence cracked. William Tyson slipped into waist-deep mud that looked solid moments before. Nathaniel Cruz, already feverish from drinking swamp water, swayed with every step. Even Jacob's steady voice carried an undertone of something he'd never allowed himself to feel: fear. Around midday, they found themselves surrounded by symbols carved into trees at precise intervals. Arrows, circles, patterns that seemed to point the way forward. But every direction they followed led them in loops, back to creeks they had already crossed, back to the same gnarled roots, back into the suffocating maze Celia controlled. She was herding them, pushing them deeper without ever touching them. William began whispering that something watched them from the water. Nathaniel claimed the moss itself moved in patterns he could almost decipher. Jacob still forced them onward, but none of the men truly believed him anymore. By late afternoon, they stumbled into a clearing littered with bones, animal remains arranged in deliberate shapes. In the center stood a small shelter of branches and moss. Inside, they found their missing supplies, their stolen food, Henry's rifle, dismantled into useless pieces and placed neatly like a child setting out toys. It was not a threat. It was a message. They decided to camp there, thinking it was defensible. But the moment darkness fell, the forest awakened with intent. Footsteps circled them, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always just beyond the firelight. Then came voices, whispered words in Creek and something older. Shapes moved in the hanging moss. And laughter, a girl's laughter, echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once, as though she had multiplied among the trees. Samuel finally broke. Screaming into the darkness, he fired blindly until Jacob tackled him. When the muzzle flashes faded, the laughter resumed. Softer now, almost amused. None of them slept, none dared. And as the fire flickered between two bright bursts and sudden dying embers, their belongings shifted around them in the dark. Packs moved, knives changed places, buttons vanished. By dawn, they understood that Celia had entered the clearing not once, but repeatedly, passing between them like mist, touching them without being seen. She had become something the forest accepted, and they had become something it rejected. The bottomlands had begun to feed on them, and Celia was simply guiding the feast. When dawn finally broke after that nightmare of shifting shadows and whispered voices, the men discovered something far worse than stolen supplies. Inside each of their packs lay small, deliberate offerings, swamp flowers arranged with delicate care, their colors bright against the mud-stained cloth. But mixed with the petals were objects that froze every man where he stood. Locks of their own hair, neatly trimmed, buttons missing from their coats, scraps cut from their shirts, small tokens taken from their bodies while they were very much awake. Celia had moved among them like wind, cutting pieces from them as though collecting samples. And in Jacob's pack was a simple drawing, 5 stick figures, 4 marked with X's across their chests. The 5th, his, stood unmarked, a question left unanswered. Nathaniel Cruz never rose to see that drawing. Fever had hollowed him through the night, leaving nothing but shallow breaths until those stopped too. No violence, no wounds, just a body that couldn't endure the swamp's poison another hour. When the men realized he was dead, they didn't weep, they didn't pray, they simply stared, empty-eyed, because death was becoming a language the bottomlands spoke fluently. Jacob made the grim decision to leave Nathaniel's body behind. They could barely carry themselves, let alone a corpse, and the ground was too wet to bury him. Samuel objected weakly, but even he knew there was no choice. They left Nathaniel on the clearing floor, evidence of how quickly men become burdens in a place that wants them gone. The forest pressed harder as they moved. Paths narrowed, roots rose like traps, water seeped where dry earth had been hours earlier. William's injured legs swelled grotesquely. Henry's breathing grew tight and frantic. Samuel muttered about voices hidden in the moss. Their feet slipped more than they stepped. Every direction looked wrong, and all the while the trees bore new symbols, fresh scratches, new arrows, circles documenting their passing. Celia wasn't running anymore. She was recording, studying, herding. Then the bottomlands claimed its second overseer. William Tyson collapsed mid-step, falling into chest-deep water that had not been there minutes before. They tried, truly tried, to pull him up, but every movement dragged them deeper. The mud seemed to cling, pulling them down as if the earth itself wanted their bodies. After a desperate struggle, even William knew the truth. "Go," he whispered, water touching his chin. "If you stay, she takes all of us." He slipped beneath the surface without a cry. The 3 remaining men, Jacob, Samuel, and Henry, stumbled away, soaked, shaking, stripped of any illusion of control. It no longer mattered that they carried weapons or that they were men accustomed to command. The bottomlands had shifted the balance completely. Celia didn't need to harm them. The forest was doing that for her Dot. By the time the sun dipped lower on the 4th day, the 3 survivors looked less like overseers and more like men who had been swallowed and spit out by the earth. Their ammunition was nearly gone, their food exhausted, their sense of direction shattered. The forest seemed to twist behind them with every step, turning familiar shapes unfamiliar and blocking every attempt to retrace their path. Jacob tried to command. Samuel tried to believe him. Henry tried not to fall apart. None succeeded. And then, without warning, the trees opened. A clearing they had never seen before spread out in front of them, bright with filtered sunlight. On the far side of a shallow pond stood Celia. Not a shadow, not a voice, not a flicker of motion in the corner of the eye. She stood plainly, deliberately, letting them see her at last. Her feet were bare but uninjured. Her clothes were practical, fitted for movement. Her face bore streaks of clay and charcoal in patterns that might have been camouflage or ritual. Her bow, handcrafted from forest wood, fiber, and stone, rested ready in her hands. Behind her, arranged in neat, deliberate rows, were the overseer's missing belongings. Rope fashioned into snares, ammunition lined up like trophies, and Henry's missing rifle disassembled into harmless pieces. Everything she had taken. Everything she had learned from them. For a long moment, nobody moved. The air felt suspended. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. The three men stood trembling at the pond's edge, rifles shaking in their hands. They saw now, not a child, not property, not prey, but someone who belonged to the forest the way they belonged to their guns. Someone who understood every sound, every shadow, every weakness they carried. Jacob found his voice first, though it cracked with exhaustion. He spoke of punishment, of consequences, of bringing her back in chains. His words landed empty. Samuel stepped forward and shouted that she had killed Nathaniel and William. Celia didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply answered, calmly, clearly, that she had harmed no one. Fever killed one. Water killed the other. The forest merely finished what their own arrogance started. Then Jacob fired, or tried to. His rifle sputtered with a dead click. Mud-sickened powder, soaked cartridges, a weapon the swamp had already claimed. In the second of stunned silence that followed, Celia drew her bow in one fluid motion and released. The arrow hissed through the air and struck the dirt 6 inches from Jacob's foot, exactly where she meant it to land. A warning, a demonstration, a promise. She spoke again, her voice steady as still water. 4 men had entered the bottomlands. 2 were already dead. The remaining 2 could walk out, or they could join the others. Jacob wasn't spared because she feared him. He was spared because dead men told no stories, and she needed a story carried back to Gresham. Needed the system that owned her to hear, finally, that knowledge could be stronger than guns, that land could choose sides, and that the hunted were not always helpless. Henry broke first. Terror cracked him open. He dropped his rifle and ran into the trees, screaming. Samuel hesitated a moment longer, torn between loyalty and the primal instinct to survive, then fled after him, abandoning his brother without looking back. Jacob remained alone, staring at the girl he had tried to break in the forest she had mastered. He asked her the only question he had left. Why let any of them live? Celia answered in words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dead men say nothing, but survivors carry warnings. And a warning was exactly what she wanted carried beyond the tree line. She lowered her bow, not as mercy, but as declaration. The bottomlands, she said, remembered everything. So did she. If Gresham sent more men, the forest would decide their fate, and next time, none would walk out. And with that, the last remaining overseer turned and staggered after the others, no longer a hunter, no longer in control, no longer anything but a trembling creature desperate to escape the land that had judged him. The forest let him go, but only because Celia allowed it. Henry Burke staggered out of the bottomlands 36 hours after the men scattered in that clearing. He didn't walk. He crawled. Mud clung to his face, his clothes hung in ribbons, his hands were shredded with scratches that formed strange patterned lines across his skin, like writing left by branches or something far more deliberate. When plantation workers found him at dawn near the eastern boundary, he was babbling incoherently, words tumbling out like broken pieces of thought. Trees moved. She was everywhere. Water listened. She touched us. She touched us while we watched. They carried him to the overseer's quarters, but coherent speech didn't return for days. Even when it did, his testimony shook the entire county. He described seeing Celia in multiple places at once, slipping through shadows, stealing from them while they aimed guns into the dark. He insisted she could hear their thoughts before they acted, that she'd guided them into every danger the forest offered. Most dismissed this as delirium, fevered nonsense from a man who had seen too much. But a few older locals, people who remembered the creek removal and whispered stories of swamp spirits, listened with pale faces and said nothing at all. A search party entered the bottomlands soon after, 10 armed men from neighboring plantations. Not one of Gresham's enslaved laborers joined them. Everyone understood why. The searchers recovered Samuel Yarrow 3 days in, face down in a creek so shallow a child could stand in it. He hadn't been shot. He hadn't been beaten. He had simply collapsed and lacked the strength to lift his head above the water. No marks of violence. Only exhaustion. Only fear. The deeper the search party went, the stranger their stories became. Men swore familiar paths shifted behind them. They found trees marked with symbols freshly carved. Supplies went missing from carefully guarded packs. Voices echoed in the distance, sometimes singing, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. By the 5th day, the search party refused to go any farther. They were seasoned hunters, men who'd tracked runaways for years, but each claimed the swamp itself felt wrong, alive in ways they couldn't explain. Gresham called off the search. 2 weeks later, hunters in a neighboring county found remains in the deep swamp. A decomposed body with Jacob Yarrow's pocket watch still in his coat. No wounds, no signs of attack. Just a man who walked in circles long enough for the bottomlands to swallow him. William Tyson and Nathaniel Cruz were never recovered at all. The swamp erased them completely. Henry Burke healed physically, but something inside him stayed broken. He refused to sleep near windows. He refused to look toward the eastern tree line. He drew symbols in the dirt for hours, repeating the same creek markings he'd seen carved into the trees. He refused every overseer job offered to him afterward. He moved to Alabama, worked quietly as a shop clerk, and spent the rest of his life warning anyone who'd listen. We weren't hunting her. She was hunting us, without ever lifting a hand. Among the enslaved community at Gresham's plantation, the story spread like an underground river. They whispered it in the quarters, passed it along field rows, carried it to neighboring plantations through coded networks slaveholders never understood. Some said Celia had become part of the forest. Others said she'd joined a hidden community of escaped people deep in the swamps. A few swore she still appeared to travelers, guiding the lost to safety before vanishing again. But the core of the story remained unchanged. The girl they had owned had beaten 5 armed men with nothing but knowledge, patience, and the land beneath her feet. Gresham's authority shattered. Overseers refused to work for him. Enslaved workers resisted in small ways, slower hands, lighter bales, tools vanishing for days. By 1842, the plantation collapsed. Gresham fled Georgia, carrying his failure like a shadow that followed him all the way to Texas. And still the story of Celia traveled, through whispers, through fear, through hope, reshaping what people believed was possible. For some, it became a warning. For others, it became a lesson. For many, it became a legend. And for the bottomlands themselves, it became part of the land's memory. In the years that followed, the Ojai bottomlands changed from a dangerous place into a whispered boundary. Part geography, part warning, part myth. Runaways who fled east toward the swamp vanished so completely that slave catchers refused to enter. Plantation owners invented stories about quicksand and wild animals, anything to avoid admitting what frightened them most: that someone who had once been enslaved had carved a path through the forest that white authority could not follow. Celia herself was never seen on the Gresham plantation again. A runaway notice was filed, the sheriff was asked to pursue her, but no one volunteered to step into the same trees that had swallowed 4 overseers whole. Among the enslaved community, her story spread through secret channels, passed in whispers over wash tubs, in coded songs between cotton rows, in night circle gatherings when they could finally speak freely. Versions differed, but every retelling held the same heartbeat. Knowledge is power, and land remembers its children. Historians would later find hints, oral accounts from Creek families, stories preserved by African-descended communities, small notes scribbled in margins of missionary journals, suggesting a hidden settlement existed deep in the bottomlands, a place where runaways learned to live off the land, where the forest sheltered them, where elders taught the old ways long outlawed by plantation life. Some named Celia as a founder, a guide, a guardian who knew the swamp better than anyone alive. Whether she lived there for decades or moved farther north remains unknowable. The swamp keeps its dead and its secrets with equal loyalty. But the impact of that October in 1839 rippled outward for generations. Between 1840 and 1860, escapes near Wilkinson County skyrocketed. Men sent to retrieve runaways reported paths that twisted behind them, symbols carved into trees, food disappearing from their packs. Some returned, shaken. Others did not return at all. The legal record tried to flatten the truth. County documents reduced the deaths to environmental misadventure and natural exposure. But the enslaved population preserved a different version, a story not about accidents, but about consequence. A story in which 5 men entered a forest believing they controlled the world, and the world taught them otherwise. As decades passed, the bottomlands grew wild again. Cypress trees swallowed old paths. Water reclaimed abandoned trails. Hunters, travelers, and curious wanderers occasionally reported strange things. Symbols carved into ancient trunks where no one lived. Distant singing in a language they couldn't identify, or the sudden appearance of a young woman who guided them to safety before disappearing like mist. Skeptics blamed imagination. Believers blamed memory. Elders simply said the forest chooses who it reveals itself to. And in quiet moments, when the wind moved through the moss like voices, some swore they heard footsteps not their own, light, sure, familiar with every inch of the land. A reminder, a warning, a legacy. Because the bottomlands had learned something in 1839 and they never forgot. Knowledge can make the weak untouchable. Courage can make the hunted unstoppable. And sometimes the smallest Sparker girl no one valued can become the forest's greatest weapon. Celia's story lived on not because she sought glory, but because she proved a truth the plantation world could never accept. The oppressed are never powerless, only underestimated. And in the deep, whispering heart of the Ojai bottomlands, the legend breathed on, alive as the forest itself.